Well, welcome. Thank you for braving the elements to join us here this evening for this discussion with Dr. Hans Blix. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here, and especially to welcome Dr. Blix and his wife here to Washington, D.C. Dr. Blix, as many of you know, was director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Director General from 1981 to 1997, guided the agency through the Chernobyl disaster, revelations of a clandestine nuclear weapons program in Iraq, and the DPRK's safeguard violations. And with respect to the latter, some of the students may know him from the Team America video. As you can see, he was not eaten by sharks after all. Under his direction, the framework for strengthened safeguards was established, and the international legal regime for nuclear energy was bolstered. Dr. Blix had a very distinguished career prior to that in various positions in the Swedish Foreign Ministry, as well as a member of Sweden's delegation to the United Nations General Assembly, member of the Swedish delegation to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then Minister for Foreign Affairs in the late 1970s. After serving as IAEA Director General, he was named Executive Chairman of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and served in that position for several years in the early 2000s. He's in town to receive the Fulbright Prize, and I just want to say just a few words about the prize. The Fulbright Prize honors the largest and most significant educational and cultural exchange program in history, as well as the career and spirit of its creator, the late Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas. The inaugural Fulbright Prize was awarded to former South African President Nelson Mandela in 1993, and it's a prize that recognizes and rewards outstanding contributions toward bringing peoples, cultures, or nations to greater understanding of others. 4 recipients of the Fulbright Prize, Nelson Mandela, Jimmy Carter, Kofi Annan, and Marty Otaseri, have later been named Nobel Peace Prize laureates. So with that, no pressure. With that, we're very delighted to welcome you to the School of International Service.
Well, as you hear, I have my career behind me, so I can speak fairly freely, not looking for anything new. And I'm delighted to be at the university. I grew up at Uppsala University in Sweden, and I visited 3 universities thereafter. I was at Cambridge, and I was at Columbia University, and I eventually landed up in Stockholm University, where I taught for a little while before I was absorbed by the foreign ministry. But I always like the critical questioning atmosphere and attitude at the university. Critical thinking is a very vital and precious product, not always used by the political establishment. The subject I put title for my lecture is "What Hope is There for Détente and Disarmament?" And currently we are clearly not in a period of détente and disarmament. In the Ukraine, we have an armed conflict involving Russia and Europe and NATO. In the Middle East, we have the IS, a new caliphate in Syria, Iraq, and in Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, we have lots of civil war. And the world military spending remains, at 2012 was the last year I saw, around $1,700 billion. This was higher in real terms than the peak near the end of the Cold War. The US share of that, you as a taxpayers might be interested in knowing, was about 40% of the world's military spending. And recently, plans in the US for what are called atomic vitalization indicated to cost up to $1 trillion during the next 3 decades. In the same period, it has not been possible to scrape up the $100 million a year needed to fund and help developing countries to participate in the effort to counter global warming, which may be the biggest threat that humanity faces. Some people are very skeptical about that, more so in the United States than in Europe, I would say. In Europe, there are very few who doubt it. Why is this? Why is the situation so bad now? Well, 5 years ago, in March 2009, it looked very hopeful. Presidents Obama and Medvedev met in London, and while they acknowledged that there will remain differences between the US and Russia, they reaffirmed, and I quote, that the enmity was long over and committed the two countries, inter alia, to step-by-step disarmament and to achieving a nuclear weapons-free world. That's what they talked about in 2009. And they committed to explore strengthening the Euro-Atlantic and European security and to resume activities in the NATO-Russia Council. Sounds like pretty distant from today. This was a great catalogue of actions, and together with President Obama's speeches, you remember from Prague and Cairo, it inspired much hope for a better international climate, and it had, of course, also a background. Why was there such an optimism? With the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, the US public had tired of war and become skeptical of armed interventions. And in 2007, another important thing happened. A quartet of respected elder US statesmen, was George Shultz and Bill Perry and Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn, published an article in the Wall Street Journal in which they said that after the end of the Cold War, nuclear deterrence was obsolete between the United States and Russia and obsolescent between elsewhere. This, to eliminate the risk of further proliferation of nuclear weapons, they urged that the US and Russia should take the lead in nuclear disarmament, and thereafter, when they had led, the other nuclear weapon states should come along. This bipartisan article was met with much enthusiasm in the US, in the elite, in the foreign policy elite, and the same way abroad. And in their election campaigns, both Obama and McCain as well, were supportive of the article and of their views of the four. They were Cold War warriors, all the 5 or 4 of them, but they had changed. And I think you who are young may not perhaps remember or feel what a metamorphosis it was when the Cold War ended. Those of us who lived through the many years of diplomacy in the Cold War, the rigidity, we felt it was really a change of the world in 1990 when the Cold War ended. And these 4 quartet, they felt the same way. Optimism was also inspired by peace research showing that the number of armed conflicts, both interstate and civil war, had been decreasing. Indeed, to many people, interstate armed conflicts seemed like a thing of the past in large parts of the world. For instance, in the North and South America, you could hardly think of a war between US and Mexico any longer. And in South America, it was very long, too, that you had an interstate war. And of course, in Europe, where we have had millennia of war, the French and the Germans, in Europe, we had now the European Union. And it was unthinkable that you could have a war between members of the European Union. So this was a very changed world. In addition, the traditional causes of interstate war, which used to be disputes about borders between states, or wishes to grab territory, or to spread religion or ideology, were beginning to look outmoded. Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait in 1990 looked like a strange echo of past ages, like he's imitating some emperor of Mesopotamia from past times. In 2006, the International Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, the WMDC, that I had chaired with an international membership, including Bill Perry, had presented a report with a number of disarmament proposals. And when we saw the report, the article by the 4 American statesmen, and the atmosphere after the London meeting, we were beginning to hope that, yes, this may be the harvest time for disarmament. But within a year after the London Obama-Medvedev meeting, the START agreement was ready and signed by the US and Russia. That was encouraging. There had also been a conference about nuclear security in the spring of 2010. Now, while the limits this treaty imposed for deployed nuclear weapons and carriers were rather modest, they were legally binding, and most important for confidence between the US and Russia was that the treaty preserved a mutual right to on-site inspection. Sadly, it turned out that the treaty was not welcome at all by everybody. It ran into a wall of the resistance in the US Senate and met some grumbling in Russia. and both bilateral and multilateral disarmament lost its momentum in 2010. What we have been witnessing for several years is rather rearmament in the world. US senators who opposed the treaty stood for preserving overwhelming, many would say excessive, US military superiority. And to win Senate approval for the START treaty, the administration had to commit to a large program, some $80 billion over a period of time, for refurbishing the US nuclear weapons sector. In Russia, many military strategists grumbled about the reduction of their nuclear arsenal that they said would compensate for the upper hand that NATO now had in conventional weapons. There was a change from the Cold War when the Russians had an upper hand in conventional weapons. Now it was the opposite, and the Russians said they needed nuclear weapons to balance that. There was also a feeling in Russia, not least after the experience of the war in Georgia in 2008, that the Russian armed forces had been allowed to rust for too long, especially during the Yeltsin period in the 1990s. The result then became a significant ongoing program for rearmament that Putin has been pushing, and that they may not be able to afford at the level and the size which they now have proposed. The Russian economy may not be able to carry that. Now, so far for Russia, for the US, China, like Russia, has also significantly increased its military budget, in part to give a better pay to their soldiers, but also to modernize their arms and to get new weapons, expanding the navy. And in many Asian countries, including China, China's strengthening of its armed forces has raised concerns and triggered larger military budgets all over Asia. And there is uncertainty as to whether China, with a phenomenal economic development and new clout, will stick to its long-declared policy of peaceful rise. A new Chinese assertiveness about islands and maritime borders has worried the region. There is no doubt that the large US military budgets and several other US measures, such as the nuclear agreement with India and new deployment of troops in Australia, the pivot, as called, are the result of concerns about China's future course. In my view, it would be important for Western policymakers to remember that China and many other Asian countries have suffered severe humiliation at the hands of the West in the past, and that respect and inclusiveness may help to avoid friction. Many of the conflicts that you see, I think, have their root in a feeling of humiliation of the past. And we have to be aware of that in our relations and our conduct of foreign policy vis-à-vis them. Interestingly, Europe is one area that has not seen any military upsurge after the end of the Cold War or since then. Military budgets in Europe have remained at or below 2% of GDP, whereas the US is well above 4% of the GDP, and the Russians are now coming up to 4% of GDP. Now, in Europe, détente had its strongest impact on, and arms reductions were the most far-reaching. With easy relations with Russia that we had, and whose weapons were rusting, many Europeans saw UN peacekeeping outside of Europe as a main task of European armed forces, not to be a territorial defense in Europe, but actually to be used by the UN outside. In the US, it used to be said at the time that Europeans, who you might remember, were for Venus, while the Americans were for Mars. Depending upon how the conflict in Ukraine develops or is solved, European attitudes to defense may change. And I can see that in my own country, where they are much worried, and I would say the majority of political parties want to increase defense. And you see in Germany, where they've been the most reluctant, even there is a pressure also to increase defense expenditures. So the executive summary of the last 5 years is rearmament, not disarmament. And some new problems have been added, like cyber warfare and the use of drones. A few consolations. There's been no new additional state developing weapons of mass destruction, and we have also a treaty concluded under the UN, the Arms Trade Treaty, which tries to restrict arms trade in conventional weapons to only licensed cases, not now get rid of the illegal trade. And we must remember that small caliber weapons probably in practice are the biggest weapon of mass destruction that you have. nuclear weapons are not used, but small caliber weapons all over the world, in millions, are the weapons of mass destruction. So the treaty is significant, and whether the US will ratify it is another question. That you will have certain lobbies here I've heard about who may not like that. For a revival of progress in disarmament, new détente is needed. On that front, the record and the outlook is mixed. In Asia, we see significant tensions. In the Middle East and the Arab Spring has brought much civil war. And now we have the ISIS and anarchy. You have, in addition, Europe and the Ukrainian conflict that is the most acute and most dangerous for the moment. While in the US, only budgetary deficits seem capable of imposing some restraint on military spending, the Obama administration has clearly sought to resist domestic and foreign pressures for engaging the United States in new armed interventions on the ground. Let me discuss the cases of North Korea and Syria, Iran, and the Ukraine. It would seem that apart from an internal collapse in the North Korea, only talks aiming at regional security involving Russia, China, Japan, and the United States, and détente could provide a way out of the tension brought to Northeast Asia by the nuclear program and the military body language of the DPRK. There is a risk also, which speculate that the North Korean military may feel they have a need for continuous tension in order to justify their own control of the country. And if that is so, then not even offers of security may help to bring about a peace and a dismantling of their nuclear program. A first military strike against the DPRK can hardly be on anybody's agenda. Seoul is, after all, within artillery range from North Korea. In Syria, what started as a civilian uprising in the wake of the Arab Spring has developed into a horrible civil war with many outside parties intervening, notably Saudi Arabia and Iran, and perhaps one could at least look at it as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. As I see it, the US administration, while sympathizing with the democratic ambitions of many Syrian groups, and so did we in Europe, and wishing to see the end of Iran-friendly Assad regime, wanted to avoid being drawn into the military fray. The dictum was no boots on the ground. And also another problem was who should one support in Syria? Which section, which group? Now luck and Russia helped President Obama to stay on his course of non-intervention when chemical weapons use nearly forced him to intervene in order to live up to a statement that such use would, I quote, alter his calculation. His reluctance was hardly prompted by an awareness that it would be a no Security Council authorization, but rather his reluctance was caused by uncertainty about where the US armed intervention would lead. Now, I regret to say that I don't think that reluctance was caused by any respect for the UN Charter. It's clear that the Security Council would never have authorized an intervention by any punishment of Assad. Luck was the second element. Luck was that the UK Parliament, with British participation in the Iraq War in the rear mirror, voted against any UK participation joining in armed action. And coming on top of limited public US support for armed action, it probably reduced activist pressure to undertake an armed intervention. Russian help came in the plan to demand Syrian adherence to the Chemical Weapons Convention and an elimination of all chemical weapons. It looked like, and I think it was a better idea than to achieve the eradication of these weapons, than for the US to act as a world policeman without UN authorization and punish Syria. And thereafter, after such punishment, go back to saying that, okay, now you've been punished, now you can go back to your war, fight with other means, but not with Syria, not with chemical weapons. Would have been a weird end. And a far better end was to eradicate all these weapons, to get rid of them, which now I think they report 97% are gone. The plan from the Russian part was not altruism. The Russians helped Assad, yes, but they also prevented a unilateral US use of force by bringing the affair into the channels of the Security Council and of the Chemical Weapons Organization, where Russia had a say. In the Security Council, they sit, they have a veto, they have influence. In the Chemical Weapons Organization, the same way, they sit in the Executive Board, they have an influence. So the whole thing was channeled from a U.S. multilateral policeman action into an international action that fell completely within the statutes of the two organizations. An added value of this unusual affair was that it demonstrated that there remained sufficient détente between the US and Russia, as well as China, to come together in a big and hot political matter. It was, you might say, a mini reset. Well, the US administration might not want to use that word, but that's the way I think it was. In the case of Iran, the US position has for a long time been that, all options are on the table. And I don't think a president can deny that there are some options that are not on the table, but at the present time, I don't think a military option really is on the table. This is what they said, that the option would be on the table unless certainty could be had that Iran stays away from a capacity to make nuclear weapons. Behind the stand is pressure from a strong and powerful US domestic opinion and pressure from Israel. It has been underlined by the presence of US aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, and there is no hint that the US would hesitate to ignore the absence of UN authorization. So again, they would disregard the restrictions of the UN Charter. If they were to launch an attack on Iranian installations, it would clearly be a violation of the UN Charter, and I don't think that has worried them. Other things have worried them. It seems clear that the Obama administration would be reluctant to take military action against Iran, as it would not know where such action could lead, somewhat similar to the Syrian case. We did not know where any military action would lead. Talks between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, are so far the preference of all, and they are going in an intensive stage this week, we know. Thus, despite serious tensions between them on many issues, they are ready, the members of the Security Council, 5 members, are ready to work jointly to seek accommodation and détente on specific serious problems. So that's what I'd call another mini reset. In the Ukraine, lastly, strong interest of major powers, Russia, the European Union, US and NATO, clash more directly than in the other cases, and many predict that the conflict, even after a settlement, will bring frosty relations between Russia and Europe for years to come. I may be naive, but I'm not that pessimistic as that. Clearly, it was a shock to Western world that Russia was ready to use armed force in Europe in violation of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, and increasingly severe economic sanctions have been an inevitable reaction to the Russian action. However, several important observations may be made about the Ukrainian situation. First of all, as nuclear powers are involved on both sides, strong efforts will be made to achieve some accommodation and to avoid direct armed confrontations between them and the risk of a serious escalation between nuclear armed states. Nuclear war entails the risk of mutually assured destruction, as we know, the MAD, and the conclusion of the Cuban crisis in 1963-62 remains alive, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This certainly remains alive in sane governments. Whether it will remain alive in a terrorist movement is another matter. Second, the accommodation might be facilitated by a belated understanding that just as the West rightly developed a policy of containment, what we call a policy of containment, against an expanding communist bloc, the Russian leadership may feel it is seeking the military containment of NATO, bloc that has crept ever closer up to the Russian border. If Russian ambitions go further than a containment, as some suspect, go further than holding Ukraine outside the NATO, then accommodation would be unlikely to happen. But if they only stay in the Crimea, which is also a violation of the UN Charter, I don't think that the conflict will escalate. If they sort of rip off eastern Ukraine, it will be a different matter. Third and last on the Ukraine, an optimistic thought would be that just as the recoiling from the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban crisis led the parties to a moment of détente in which the partial test ban was born in 1963, an accommodation after the Ukraine crisis might lead to a strong wish for renewed détente. And I think that the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which requires the ratification of the US and China, a few others, would be what we have thought as a low-hanging fruit, but it's been hanging there for a very long time. And maybe there would be an opportunity after an accommodation on the Ukraine. Now let me conclude with some reflections on the role of the United Nations. The security system of the Charter of 1945 was based on the idea that the 5 Allied winners of the Second World War should, if I may put it a little irreverently, continue as a kind of junta of warlords to maintain peace in the world. As we know, the Cold War gave them enough headache to avoid war between themselves. As many warlords are found, they couldn't keep peace between themselves, and that's what happened here. And the UN system was thereby paralyzed. The whole basis for the Security Council fell off. However, with the end of the Cold War, the Security Council, with its core, the Junta of 5, was able to come together. And in 1991, President Bush the Elder made use of this to stop Saddam's occupation of Kuwait. He talked with justified pride about a new international order. And while producing much disarmament during the détente in the beginning of the 1990s, this order did not last, however. It did produce big results at the beginning of the 90s, and it did not last, and many declared it finished when in 2003, Bush the Junior started the second Iraq War. This was a too pessimistic verdict that the preconditions for cooperation were totally lost with the second war in Iraq in 2003, as many had predicted then. I started my comments with the Obama-Medvedev meeting in London in 2009 that seemed to revive cooperation and radical disarmament. And that was, we shall remember, after the 2003 war. That effort in 2009 failed, and right now we live in a cold spell. However, we can also see patches remaining of the détente that allow cooperation on specific important issues between Russia and the West, especially the US, like the chemical weapons case in Syria, which I talked about a while ago, and the concern about nuclear weapons in Iran and in North Korea, and the common concern about ICS. In all these cases, you can see that despite the cold spell that has come and that puts its wet blanket over the Security Council, you have cases where some permanent members come together and cooperate. If such patches of cooperation détente were to expand, there could be hope for a revival in the sphere of disarmament, where you now see none, and where the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva has been in comas for the last over 10 years. Even if you do not have a vast expansion of cooperation in these disarmament cases, in the disarmament sphere, cooperation will be indispensable, and several existential global issues, for instance, the threat to our climate, global warming, and the threat to epidemics like Ebola, will force them to cooperate. The institution that can be the focal point for such cooperation and that can confer legal authority on conclusions is the Security Council. The Security Council, in distinction from meetings in London or meetings between great power, has a legal power enshrined in the Charter of taking decisions which will be binding on all members. That's a totally different status from agreements that reached ad hoc between different nuclear weapon states. We have good reasons to consider the difficult question how the Security Council could further increase its weight and be made more effective through limited enlargement and through some voluntary limitation in the use of the veto. It's a difficult issue, and they have been wrestling with it for years, but it's one that may come up again. We also have good reasons to ensure that the family of UN organizations like the WHO, the FAO, the IAEA, the WTO, trade organization, and the IMF, located in Washington, remain effective and responsive to the collective needs of the world community. And I would end by saying, and that the international civil service, to which I myself belong, remains competent and independent. The decision makers in the Security Council or elsewhere in government, they need an factual dossier to base their decisions on. They may be elected, they may have a democratic mandate, and they may wish to follow their policies. But but they should have a factual dossier in front of them in the Security Council and elsewhere. We provided in UNMOVIC that I headed a factual dossier for the Council, but others had stronger national dossier that they pursued, and they happened to be entirely based upon irrelevant and erroneous information and fact. So I think that preserving for the UN a civil service that is independent and is objective, is not corrupt, not influenced by member states, is a vital service that the states need. It's in their interest that we have it. It's not a sacrifice. It's in their interest that they should have a factual dossier in front of them. I'll be ready to answer questions that you may have on that point, but I have not wanted to speak much about what we did in New York. You have heard about it, and you also, all I'm sure, had seen the YouTube, the Team America's film, which I have laughed at myself. Of course, it's always wonderful to watch how an international bureaucrat is falling through a trapdoor and being devoured by sharks. That's great fun. I laughed greatly at it. However, I can say already now that I somewhat doubt the lesson of it, because the innuendo is that such statements or conclusions by international bureaucrats are irrelevant, that they just fall through a trapdoor. Now, that's not quite so. You take now the international inspectors that come from the CSC in the Ukraine, or if you take the inspectors who happened to be in Korea in 1950 and gave their reports, or if you take the inspection that they will want to have in Iran for a solution of the present conflict, you realize that no, the actual mounting of independent inspection and their reporting, dry as they may sound, have quite a lot of significance. But a shark type of greater fun, I agree with that. Thank you.
Those wide-ranging remarks really covered a lot of ground, and I also want to say how grateful I am to our co-sponsors. We're sitting in front of a SIS banner, as is our wont here in the School of International Service, but very grateful for the co-sponsorship by the College of Arts and Sciences, and we're delighted to have Dean Peter Starr here, and also the Washington College of Law, and sorry that Dean Claudio Grossman is not able to join us this evening. I wanted to start by, and we'll open it up to everyone momentarily. I wanted to follow up, both given the remarks and then your long experience with the United Nations, to ask you to elaborate a little bit on what you see as necessary for the United Nations to remain a vibrant international organization going forward. You did note what many, in terms of international peace and security issues, see as a major high point, and that was the response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. In many ways, the kind of signature event that the UN was founded to deal with, one country invading another, and of course we've seen lots of other conflict cases that don't look like that. As you also alluded to toward the end, lots of concerns about the permanent membership of the Security Council, and the way that doesn't match with the power transformations that are taking place, and the use of the veto. And so what do you think needs to be done for the United Nations to remain the leading international institution in the world? And are there other institutional needs out there that aren't being met that you think we will need additional institutions to be developed? We're still largely operating within a system of institutions that were created after the Second World War, and yet we're living in a very different environment today.
Right. Well, I think it's important to get back to this point of the creation of the security system of the UN, and I reverently call them a junta of warlords, the five. They were. And the Charter speaks about the equality of states. but they clearly recognize that some animals are more equal than others. And they gave themselves permanent seats in the Security Council, and they veto rights. And if you look at how peace comes to national states, nations, it's also not an unusual development that some warlords do get together. And they create order, not very much legally, not very constitutionally, not very democratically, but the forces, existing forces, come together. So I think the idea was good, and Senator Fulbright was someone who was very much in favor of the creation of the UN. He wanted to have stronger military teeth, actually, and I think President Roosevelt talked him out of that. Now, the UN has, theoretically, and in the statute they have military teeth, which no one talks about. In Article 47 of the UN Charter, there is a military staff committee that was supposed to be consisted of the joint chiefs of staff of each of the 5 permanent members. Well, they meet occasionally, but I don't think they've had any real importance in a situation. But that was the thought, much, much further than we are now. They realized later on that we couldn't get that far, and the 5 warlords, of course, have maintained their separate military capacities. And whereas the creation of a civilized state comprises, in most cases, the disarming of the civilians and the monopolization of the armed forces in the hands of a central government. That's not what we have in the international world. The states are still keeping their arms separately, and what we are trying is to get a disarmament of them, and not very successfully indeed. Now, the precondition, of course, was that the 5 would stick together, and that didn't work, but it came together in 1991 in a lucky way, and during the 90s, we should be aware that very many peacekeeping operations were started and operated. It was not just the Iraq War. A lot of other things happened and continue to happen. They still do that, but the Iraqi War was more dramatic. So we see it. Now, what are the weaknesses in the Council? Well, sadly, I think that the weaknesses are mostly pointed by those who knock at the door and who want to get in. And that's Japan, which is a big power. It's India, it's another big power. And it's Germany and Brazil. It's less Germany. Germans, I think, have been toying more with the idea that the European Union, that now has France and the UK as permanent members, that the European Union should have 1 seat in the future, which I think is also a good idea, because how can you have members of the European Union sit in the Council and vote different ways, or argue different ways? That's a little odd. So I think if one is eager to retain the limited size of the Council, and that's a good idea if you want to have a workable Council, then for the Europeans to have 1 seat, I think, would be a good idea. Now, what then is the importance of getting Japan, India, say Brazil, into the Council? It is, I don't think many of the decisions would have been very different if they had been there and had a veto, but it certainly would give much more weight to the economic power of the Council. And I think it's desirable that the Council should exude all kinds of power, both military and the economic power. So from that point, it's there. On the other hand, all the others who are outside the Council, they will feel dissatisfied that here is a core, that the junta will be just a little bigger, and it's a core, and they are ignored. So there are ideas under which you would have a more frequent membership, frequent participation. You would elect these additional members, but they would not sit there permanently, but they would come in more often than the others. It would be desirable that this ACOUT Council is already now, I think, in a position to do very important things. It would be even heavier, more important if it were expanded. But I don't think I don't really sort of applaud the wishes of these countries to get in, because they want to have it reaffirmed that they are great powers. And I don't think anyone needs to have that. But their participation in economic power is a significant one. So this is one thing. The great thing about the Council, as I remarked, is that decisions are binding. Decisions taken by the Security Council are binding on all members. They will not be obliged to submit troops, but economic sanctions, for instance, are binding on them. So while negotiating something, reaching an agreement on anything, that takes a lot of time. And an agreement requires the consent of each party. Here, if the Council disagreed, you get a decision that is binding on everybody. You take resolution 1540, for instance, which is about demanding of states to impose legislation ensuring that there will be, that they will punish any individual who tries to go for weapons of mass destruction anywhere. It's much more than that. But anyway, it's to introduce penal legislation. The Council can decide that all member states must introduce this legislation, and it's perfectly legal in the international community. This is the great trick, I think, in the Security Council. Now, you asked me what other reforms. Well, the General Assembly, of course, is a very unwieldy mechanism. The first time I came there was in 1950. When that was the year they adopted the so-called Acheson Plan and the United Action for Peace after the Korean War. There was less than 60 members in those days, so it was, and it has become very unwieldy. At the same time, it is an important opinion, expressing world opinion. Of course, when you have China with 1 billion citizens, or India with 1 billion, and you have the Mauritius, or you have the Pitcairn Island or something, it's a very odd reflection of world opinion, but nevertheless some kind of reflection of it. If you take a case of Iran today, and the US wish to bomb Iranian installations, and you took it to the General Assembly, you would have a clear, vast majority protesting against it. So there are some things that you can test also in the context of the General Assembly. If you had taken the Iraq War, it was not only that the US and others did not have the sanction of the Security Council. If they had gone to the General Assembly again, they would have had a strong majority against it. So the Council as a body reflecting a rather poor way, but nevertheless reflecting world opinion is of value. In addition, it's a place where issues can be initiated, can be taken up. The whole issue of environment was taken up in the General Assembly. The issue of the law of the sea was once raised by Malta in the General Assembly. And we got 4 important conventions, modern conventions regulating the rules applying to the law of the sea through an initiative in the General Assembly. So it's a great place where you can start things also. But it is unwieldy, and the focus, I think, rightly is on the Security Council. It doesn't mean that we should forget that. For the rest, I think the Secretariat, I spoke about the importance of having an international civil service that is objective and that is a high standard, that you avoid corruption. It's not an easy thing to maintain. Hammarskjöld, my countryman, of whom we are very proud, he was someone who stood very, very strongly for an international civil service. The Brits were the ones who introduced it once, but it is a great, great value to have. For the other organizations, of course, it's, I think, encouraging to see the international community is a poorly developed, yes, but we are getting institutions that are of great value. If you ask me what did I think was the most important thing I've done in my life, I would say the 16 years that I was the head DG of the IAEA were the most important, the most productive. Why? Well, because we built up an important legal infrastructure for the operation of peaceful nuclear energy. Well, there were conventions about inspection, there were conventions about safety, conventions about waste disposal and spent fuel, there were about indemnities, about responsibility, and there were services built up for this, sending out people to states to look at their nuclear installations and helping them, etc. There are regulations of an enormous amount. And this, I think, is new. It didn't exist before 1957. It's new, so there's something very new. If you take World Health Organization, again, it's an enormous amount of things that we don't really notice of. Gradually, the international community is equipping itself with institutions, with regulations, with services. And that is a great value. They don't get much publicity, but it's a great value, and I was very happy that I had 16 years of that.
Well, I think we've got microphones on both sides here if people have questions and would like to queue up at the microphones. And if you could just identify yourself and try to ask a brief question so we can get as many in as possible. We have about 10 minutes left, so please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Aranjana. I'm a second-year PhD student in non-proliferation here in SIS. I have 2 very quick questions, if I may. The first question is, what role do you see two different constituencies playing in the new nuclear order? The first constituency comprises countries like, say, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, and the second constituency would be non-NPT countries such as India, Pakistan, Israel. And for full disclosure, I am from India. So that's the first question. And the second question is, in 2009, President Obama, before signing the New START treaty, he also sanctioned $80 billion for renewal of the American nuclear complex. And recently, in American media, there has been a lot of reports and criticism against President Obama for apparently backsliding on his vision for disarmament. And again, on the other side, you see people claiming that in order to maintain a credible minimum deterrence, you need to have a nuclear complex which is not aging. So which camp do you belong to, or do you have a third camp? So these are two questions.
I find difficult to hear what
So the two questions are, first of all, within the international order, sort of two different groups and their role. One, Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil, and then a second, the countries that have not acceded to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What do you see in terms of interactions that might affect the international order? And the second question, that while President Obama spoke about disarmament early in his first term, he signed the New START treaty with President Medvedev, he also provided significant additional money to help maintain and extend the U.S. nuclear complex. And then there have been a lot of media reports recently about the robustness of the U.S. nuclear arsenal and the amount of money going into ensure its capacity for deterrence, which seems to be at odds with the president's early emphasis, really coming out of as you pointed out, the article by the four wise men talking about the need to move to a nuclear-free world.
I remember once I had a question after a lecture in Denmark, and someone said, now on nuclear weapons, could you not at least achieve so much disarmament that we have enough nuclear weapons to kill each other once? Isn't that enough? And I think there is a fair amount of reasonableness in that. Like Obama, I don't think that nuclear disarmament is going to go very fast. But I agree with the four wise men of the US that it could be very considerably reduced without any risk, but rather gaining in it. To eradicate the nuclear weapons altogether will require a different atmosphere and perhaps a different Security Council. I don't look that far. But when you are at 1,500 nuclear weapons now, I mean, that is far beyond the necessary thing and cost a lot of money. It's interesting that the military in many countries are not very keen on the nuclear weapons because they feel they cost money and they cannot be used. Right. They want to have conventional weapons, which they feel that they can play with that. But there is especially in the US, I think there is such a strong opinion, particularly in the military and in some civilian circles. I mean, you also carry your own handguns in your glove boxes in the cars, and we don't do that in Europe, and we are closer to Venus than to Mars, and we hope that we can rub off some of that attitude to you. Now, and I said, I don't think that you can get very far without a different political climate. I wish one could do disarmament, and one can have hotlines and a few other things. Even during the Cold War, there were agreements between the US and Russia. But to go much further than that, I think you would need a détente coming about. And maybe we get there. I don't think there are no serious conflicts, really, which we have. We're not fighting about borders or about land grab or about ideology any longer. Everybody is a sort of market economy of some kind and saying that they strive to democracy everywhere. So the world that really did change with the end of the Cold War. I wish that the governments also had discovered that rather than getting hung up on various smaller issues. Now, in the case of Russia, we say that, look here, Russia is dangerous still. And I live close to it. I see how the air traffic or the inspection, they fly in the Baltic from the Russian side, from NATO side, from the Swedish side, all over. And the temperature is rising. And that it does contain certain dangers in this. So a de-escalation is desirable. You could have sparks flying from the current situation, and that would be very bad. Now, you asked also about the non-proliferation. Now, there is, it's really only North Korea that claims that they have withdrawn from the non-proliferation treaty, and then, of course, you have the old ones, the India and Pakistan. They are not going to move out of it, and Israel is not going to move out of it either. And India, Pakistan may be in a different climate. They will have to solve the Kashmir, but I doubt it. I think that they tend to regard those nuclear weapons as a sign of prestige today. Even in a country like Brazil, some people, I think, would toy with the idea. The government, I think, is categorically against it, but I think they look at it as a matter of prestige. And I think that's a mentality, a military mentality that I'm very strongly opposed to. You know, my father was a doctor in the Marine. He was given a sable for parades. And when we see Angela Merkel arriving somewhere in France, there's always a guard of honor, and they students stand there with their bayonets. Well, for heaven's sake, in the 20th century, to have this very civilian German important leader being saluted by bayonets, I think they're very antiquated about that. In the 19th century, people were dueling, and that's a very honorable way of settling disputes within itself. Today, no one is dueling any longer. I think this military mentality is something that we also have to combat. It plays its role. And incidentally, I'm not very much fond of the idea of having women in combat positions. I think it's a great advantage. Women are more peaceful, so it's we who should emulate them, I think, rather than they emulate us. So
we have
I don't
time.
think it's going to change on the India, Pakistan, and Israel.
Thank you.
We have time just for one more question, but we have a reception afterwards, so I hope that people that have questions that they didn't get to ask will be able to ask. So quick question and a quick answer.
Yeah. So
Will you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Sarang Shidore, University of Texas at Austin. The quick comment I had was on the India-Pakistan. I think it's a very serious situation, and it's potentially getting worse. And there is a nuclear element, so I think we are still in that old world, in that part of the world. My question is, do you see value in the Chinese proposal of a no first use accord, global agreement on no first use? China provides that no first use guarantee. India provides a weak version of it. But the proposal is that the whole world get together and sign such an interim because disarmament is far away. What do you think about that? Thank you.
So no first use, global no first use.
I think it would be very desirable, but I doubt very much that you'll get it. During the Cold War, when Russia had so much conventional weapons, and NATO side had little, then the NATO side did not rule out the first strike. And if you look at India and Pakistan, I think that Pakistan does not rule out the first strike because India would have the superiority. China is, I think, the only country that has declared publicly that they forsake and they renounce any first use. Some people are not sure that it's so credible. Who knows when you get there? It would be in itself a desirable thing, but it's not clear how credible it will be. Would anyone dare to rely on it? I don't think so. I mean, I think that the missile, global missile scheme that you have been pursuing at how many billions of dollars here will continue to guard against the possible first strike from the other side. And that will be to the great satisfaction of the war industries. I'm not sure that there will be any other great use.
Well, it's been wonderful having you here at American University, and again, congratulations on the receipt of the Fulbright Prize, and thank you all very much for coming out this evening, and encourage you to stay after if you have additional questions that you would like to ask Dr. Blix. So thank you very much.
Thank you.